In the Macedonian court at Pella, sometime around the year 367 before the Common Era, a physician named Nicomachus was at work. His hands moved with the particular sureness of a man who had spent decades learning to read the body, not as a mystery to be feared, but as a structure to be understood. The way a swelling in the throat told one story, the way a discoloration of the skin told another, each small finding a thread to be followed with patience and care. At his side watching was his son. The boy was perhaps 15 or 16 years old, and he stood close enough to see what the hands were doing, close enough to notice where his father's attention went, when the visible examination gave way to the more careful, inward kind of looking that happens when a physician stops performing certainty and begins, honestly, to think. The boy had learned many things by standing there. He had learned that the world rewards attention. He had learned that a thing seen quickly and a thing seen carefully are in some important sense different things. And he had learned, though he would not yet have had the words for it, that there is a kind of pleasure in close observation that is its own justification, that looking carefully at the world is not merely a means toward some other end, but something that the mind pursues for its own sake, as naturally as a plant turns toward light. That boy was Aristotle, and the question that would come to define the whole of his philosophical life, the question of why anything exists at all, why the world that lay before his physician father's careful hands should be here rather than not, was not born in an academy or a library or a long night of solitary reading. It began here in the unremarkable intimacy of a medical examination, in the habit of a child who had learned before he could reason that the world in front of him was worth looking at, and that looking was where everything worth knowing began. There is something in that early habit of watching that set the course of everything that followed. Nicomachus was not a theoretical man. He was a court physician in the tradition of the Asclepiads, the hereditary order of healers who traced their lineage to Asclepius, the god of medicine, and who passed their knowledge down through practice rather than abstraction. The knowledge he had was knowledge of the living body in its living conditions, of blood and breath and bone, of the way illness moved through a body and left it altered, of the particular textures of health and its absence. It was an empirical knowledge, built observation by observation over years, and it was the first kind of knowledge Aristotle knew before he encountered anything called philosophy, before he had read a single line of Plato, or heard anyone speak of the nature of justice or the immortality of the soul. He had grown up in close proximity to someone who believed, as a practical matter, that understanding comes from attending carefully to the thing itself, that the path from ignorance to knowledge runs through the particular, the concrete, the actual and present fact. Philosophy, when it found him, arrived in contrast. It arrived in the form of a city and an institution, Athens and the Academy of Plato, and it brought with it a way of thinking that moved in precisely the opposite direction, away from the particular and toward the general, away from the visible and toward the invisible, away from the world that could be examined with careful hands and toward the world that could only be apprehended by the purified intellect of a philosopher who had trained himself to look past appearances. Aristotle walked into that world at the age of 17. The year was 367, and the road he traveled from Stagira in the north was long and dusty, and he carried with him into the colonnaded gardens of the Academy everything he had already, without knowing it, become. The Academy stood just outside the walls of Athens in a grove sacred to the hero Academus, and it had been home to Plato's philosophical work for roughly 20 years by the time Aristotle arrived. It was not a school in any institutional sense. There were no fees, No formal curriculum, no examinations to pass. It was something more like a sustained philosophical community, a group of thinkers who had gathered around one very serious mind and who spent their time working through questions that Plato had put on the table. Questions about justice and knowledge, about the soul and its fate after death, about the nature of beauty and virtue and the good, and above all about what it means for something to be real. The question of reality was the center of everything Plato did, and the answer he gave to it was one of the most striking and influential answers in the history of thought. Plato held that the things we see and touch, the horses and trees and chairs and faces of everyday experience, are not fully real. They are, at best, imperfect copies of something more real, more stable, and more perfectly itself than anything that exists in the changing, transitory world of matter and sensation. That something more real he called the forms, eternal, abstract, separately existing entities that do not change and cannot be destroyed, each one the perfect instance of what the things of this world imperfectly resemble. There is a form of horse, and all actual horses are approximations of it, sharing in its hoarseness to varying degrees, dependent on it for whatever reality they possess, but unable to be fully or perfectly what it is. There is a form of beauty, and all beautiful things are beautiful only by participating in that form, the way a dimly lit room is bright only by sharing in brightness without being its source. The world we inhabit is, on this account, a kind of shadow world, and knowledge is not a matter of examining shadows more carefully, but of turning away from them and learning to look at the forms themselves with the eye of the intellect. Aristotle sat in the afternoon light of the academy and listened to all of this. He was by every account one of Plato's most gifted students, and he spent 20 years there, 20 years of close engagement with the most brilliant and demanding philosophical mind of his age. He absorbed the questions Plato asked, and the methods Plato used, and the extraordinary seriousness with which Plato treated the work of philosophy. And yet something in him could not follow Plato to the conclusion. Plato's forms were eternal and unchanging, but they existed nowhere in the world. Aristotle had spent his earliest years attending to. They were more real than anything that could be observed, and yet no physician's hands could ever encounter them. They were the source of all intelligibility in the world, and yet they were definitionally absent from the world, separated from it by a metaphysical gulf that Plato acknowledged, and to Aristotle's increasing dissatisfaction seemed unable to bridge. The dissatisfaction was not impatience in finding torture patient. It was not arrogance, it was the dissatisfaction of a mind that had been trained at its most fundamental level to stay in contact with the actual, and that found in Plato's doctrine a beauty it could not deny and an insufficiency it could not ignore. The question Aristotle kept returning to was simpler than any of the arguments it generated, and it was this: if the forms are the source of what makes things what they are, how do the things in the world partake of them? If hoarseness is a form that exists separately from all horses, what is the mechanism by which any actual horse becomes horse-like? Plato had a word for this: participation, methexis, but the word Aristotle came to feel was not an answer. It was a name for the problem, dressed up as a solution. The horses standing in actual fields were what interested Aristotle, the trees growing in actual gardens, the fish swimming in the actual straits of the northern Aegean, the way the evening light changed the texture of a hillside. These things, looked at carefully, told a different story from the one Plato was telling. They were not pale reflections of something more real. They were real. They were the sort of thing that deserved explanation, not dismissal, and the explanation they deserved was one that remained in contact with them, that found their intelligibility within them rather than outside them, that honored the physician's practice of staying with the particular until the particular yielded its own form of knowledge. Plato died in the year 347. The leadership of the academy passed to his nephew Speusippus, and Aristotle left. The departure has sometimes been described as a rupture, as though the student had broken with the teacher in bitterness or disappointment. The historical record suggests something more measured. Aristotle's departure was the emergence of an independent mind into its own work, a mind that had taken from Plato everything Plato had to give, and that now needed different conditions to follow the questions in the direction they were pulling. It was not an ending, but a beginning of a different kind, and it would take another decade of travel and research and teaching before that beginning found its fullest expression. The years after the academy were years of extraordinary empirical work. Aristotle traveled to the Aegean coast, to Assos, and then to the island of Lesbos, where he threw himself into the study of natural history with an energy and thoroughness that had never been seen before in the philosophical tradition. He studied the breeding habits of fish. He dissected cephalopods. He catalogued the varieties of animal life with the attention of someone who found in the diversity of the natural world not chaos, but an intricate and almost overwhelming intelligibility, a world that rewarded the patience of the careful observer at every level and in every direction he chose to look. The philosophy he was building was rooted in this work, and the rootedness was not accidental. The natural world was not for Aristotle an obstacle to clear thinking. It was the primary text. It was where the questions began, and where, in the deepest sense, the answers had to be found. Sometime around the year 343, Aristotle received a commission that separated him from his research and placed him in one of the most consequential positions a philosopher has ever occupied. Philip of Macedon, the king who was in the process of consolidating power over most of the Greek world, invited Aristotle to serve as tutor to his son, a boy of 13 named Alexander. Aristotle accepted and traveled to Mieza, a village near the Macedonian capital, where he set up what has been called a temporary school in the gardens of a sanctuary, open paths through a wooded space, the kind of outdoor environment in which walking and thinking could be, as they were for Aristotle, a single continuous activity. What passed between Aristotle and the young Alexander is only partially recoverable. Later tradition would fill the gap with stories, most of them too perfectly symbolic to be entirely trusted. But the image of the philosopher walking slowly through that garden beside his royal student, pausing to examine a plant at the edge of the path or to observe the behavior of an insect in the grass, and saying in measured words that the world itself, looked at carefully, is where philosophy begins. That image is not merely legendary. It reflects something real about what Aristotle believed and how he taught. The natural world was not a distraction from serious thought. It was the ground of serious thought. The philosopher's task was not to escape it, but to attend to it with sufficient care that its deep structure began to show. The tutorial at Mieza lasted perhaps 3 years. Alexander eventually left to accompany his father on campaign, and Aristotle returned to Athens. In 335, with Macedonian dominance over Greece now secure and Athens itself under Macedonian influence, Aristotle founded his own school. He chose a site near a temple of Apollo Lakios in the northeast of the city, and the school took its name from that grove, the Lyceum. It was here, in the remaining 12 years before his death, that the full architectural project of his philosophy took shape. The Lyceum was not the academy. The differences were practical as much as philosophical, but the practical differences pointed to something deeper. The academy had been a community organized around the single commanding vision of one thinker. The Lyceum was a collaborative research institution staffed by specialists and assistants committed to the systematic investigation of every domain of the natural and human world it could reach. Aristotle was the organizing intelligence, but the work was distributed across disciplines in a way that suggested he was not primarily trying to produce disciples who would think as he thought. He was trying to build a kind of knowledge that no single mind could build alone, a knowledge that would take the whole of the available world as its subject and refuse to privilege any one part of it over another. The covered walkway of the Lyceum, the Peripatos, which gives the school its other name, the Peripatetics, was where much of this thinking was done. It ran along the northern edge of the gymnasium, and Aristotle used it in the mornings for the more demanding philosophical discussions, the ones that required the full concentrated attention of an audience capable of following difficult argument. In the evenings, walking the same path with a wider group of students, the discussions were more general, more accessible, more concerned with the kind of broad questions that any educated person might find worth thinking about. The rhythm of the walking mattered. The measured pace, the physical engagement of the body in motion, the way the conversation could pause and resume as naturally as breathing, all of it was part of a model of philosophical inquiry that was, at its foundation, unhurried. Unhurried because the questions deserved it. The intellectual climate of 4th century Athens was in many ways a climate shaped by urgency and loss. The Peloponnesian War, the catastrophic conflict between Athens and Sparta that had ended nearly a century before Aristotle's arrival in the city, had not only destroyed the political confidence of an era, it had unsettled the philosophical project that had grown up alongside that confidence. The city that had produced Socrates and Plato and the whole great flowering of democratic culture was now, by the time Aristotle founded the Lyceum, a city under Macedonian authority, its political independence reduced to a form rather than a substance. The questions this raised were not only political, they were philosophical in the deepest sense. Questions about what endures, about what the order of things actually is beneath the surface of political arrangements, about what the natural world is made of, and why it is the way it is, and what it means for something to be real. These were not questions for an afternoon. They were questions for a lifetime, and perhaps for many lifetimes. And the Lyceum was built on the understanding that the answers, if they came at all, would come slowly and incompletely, and from many different directions at once. The library of the Lyceum was part of this understanding. Aristotle is sometimes credited, in ancient sources, with being among the first private collectors of books in the ancient world, and the Lyceum's library was by the standards of the time extraordinary, not just in its breadth, but in its character. Alongside the philosophical scrolls, there were natural history specimens, anatomical drawings, maps, and collections of the constitutions of 158 city-states, assembled for a project of political philosophy that required the kind of empirical foundation that armchair speculation could never provide. The library was a portrait of a mind, and the mind it was a portrait of was one that believed, with a steadiness that never required assertion, that the whole of the world was worth understanding, and that no part of it was too small or too ordinary to merit the philosopher's attention. This is perhaps the most important thing to hold about Aristotle before anything else, the ordinariness of his starting point, the great questions he would spend his life working through, questions about why anything exists, about what makes a thing the thing it is, about what moves the world and holds it in motion. None of these began in mystical insight or in the desire to escape the ordinary world. They began in it. They began in the habits of a physician's son who had spent his earliest years watching careful hands attend to the facts in front of them. They began in the specific salt-edged waters of the northern Aegean and the living creatures that moved through them. They began in a walk. There is a passage in the opening lines of Aristotle's Metaphysics, the great work on first philosophy that he would write in the Lyceum's later years, where he says that all human beings by nature desire to know, and as evidence for this he points to the delight people take in their senses. Einvertagstalsing, even apart from any practical use, those senses might serve. The pleasure of seeing, the simple irreducible fact of finding the visible world interesting. He cites this as the first evidence that the desire to understand is not secondary to some more practical impulse, but is primary, constitutive, part of what it means to be the kind of being a human being is. The remark is casual, almost offhand, but it carries the whole weight of the philosophy to come. The world, seen for the first time, is interesting. That interest is not a problem to be solved. It is a beginning. Aristotle had been shown this by his father before he had words for it. He had seen a physician lean over a patient and look at the patient, the way a philosopher looks at a question, with the full, patient, unhurried attention of someone who takes seriously the possibility that this particular thing, attended to long enough, will yield something worth knowing. Wohltide, he had seen that the world is, at its surface, already remarkable, not because it is perfect or because it rewards easy inspection, but because it is there, because the fish in the northern sea is there, complex and specific and exactly as it is, and not otherwise, because the leaf on the path of the peripatos is there, because the heart that beats in the chest of the patient under Nicomachus's hands is there, moving, doing what it does, for reasons that a careful mind might eventually begin to understand. The Lyceum in its early years had the quality of something that has finally found its proper form. The institution matched the intelligence behind it. The practice of philosophical discussion and the pace of unhurried walking matched the temperament of a mind that had always found its best thinking in motion. The collaborative, multidisciplinary character of the research matched the conviction that no single approach to the world was sufficient, that the natural philosopher and the political theorist and the biologist and the student of logic were all working on the same question from different angles, that the question was large enough to accommodate all of them, and loose enough at its edges to keep surprising whoever came to it with open attention. In the evenings, when the formal work of the day was finished, there was a particular quality to the Lyceum's quiet. The grove of Apollo Lykios lay around it, old trees in the fading light, the city audible in the middle distance. The first lamps were being lit in the rooms where the scrolls were kept, and the warm, unsteady light they gave fell across the shelves in the particular way that lamplight has of making even familiar things look worth a second look. Aristotle may or may not have been there in those moments. The historical record does not say, but the institution he built was the kind of institution that takes on a life independent of its founder, that becomes over time a place where the habits of a founder's mind are embodied not in a doctrine, but in a practice, a way of moving through the day and the questions it raises, a rhythm of attention that is in itself a philosophical commitment. The commitment was this, that the world, attended to honestly and with sufficient patience, does not run out of things to teach. That inquiry is not a movement toward an end, but a way of inhabiting the world, a way of being present to it without demanding from it more than it can give. that the questions which cannot be answered quickly are not the questions to be avoided, but the questions most worth living with, because they are the questions that are actually there, at the bottom of things, underneath all the familiar surfaces that daily life covers them with. Every great inquiry begins this way, not with an answer, not even with a fully formed question, but with a certain quality of attention, patient, open, alert to the ordinary, and ready, without urgency or drama, to be surprised by what the ordinary contains. The Lyceum stood in its grove as the evening came on. The lamps held their small circles of light against the dark. The path of the Peripatos lay quiet, still carrying in its worn stone some residue of the day's thinking. Outside, the city of Athens moved through its ordinary evening, and beyond the city, the wider world continued in all its variety and complexity and dense, inexhaustible particularity, the same world that a physician's son from Stagira had been watching carefully since before he had any reason to know what he was looking for. The questions were not yet named, the frameworks were not yet built. What was present in that dusk was something simpler and in many ways more fundamental, a place where careful thinking was considered worth the time, where the whole of the natural world was held to be a proper subject for philosophical attention, and where every inquiry, however large, however patient it required the inquirer to be, was understood to begin not with certainty, but with a particular kind of looking, open to whatever the world, honestly examined, might choose to show. That looking is where everything begins, not in a great declaration or a solitary vision, but in the quiet of a grove, in the light of the first lamps, in the habit of a mind that had learned, very early, that the world in front of it was the only place the deepest questions about the world could honestly start. Aristotle unrolled the scroll slowly, the papyrus stiff at the edges from handling, and began to read aloud. The room held perhaps a dozen students. The morning was early enough that the light through the open side of the Lyceum still lay at an angle across the stone floor, and his voice, measured and without ceremony, carried the first sentence of what he had written into the air between them. All human beings, by nature, desire to know. He paused there, not for effect, not waiting for agreement, but because the sentence itself seemed to ask for a moment of stillness after it. The desire he was naming was not ambition or pride. It was something older and quieter than either of those, the simple orientation of a mind toward the world it finds itself in, which is present in a child watching water move over stones, and in an old man returning, night after night, to the same unresolved question. The students listened. Outside, the trees of the grove moved slightly in the morning air, and what Aristotle went on to say, what the scroll held that he was still reading toward, was not yet another account of what things are made of, or another argument about which virtues are highest, or another set of instructions for how to reason correctly. What he was opening, in those rooms and those years, was something more fundamental than any of those. He was asking what it means for anything to be real at all, not this thing or that thing, not bronze or water or justice or number, but being itself. Existence considered simply as existing, which is the question underneath every other question, and which, once genuinely asked, has a way of making every other question feel strangely incomplete until it is answered. He had a word for the inquiry he was beginning, the study of being quat being, to on in his own language, being, considered specifically as being, not as physics considers things in motion, not as mathematics considers quantity, not as ethics considers action, but being just as being, the simplest and most difficult subject possible. A thing exists. That sentence, stripped to its minimum, is already a philosophical statement, so dense that centuries of careful thought have not exhausted it. Aristotle knew this. He had been circling the question long enough to recognize that no one before him had quite addressed it in the form it deserved. He was not saying they had been careless. He was saying the question has a depth that takes time to find. Those who had thought about it before him, and some of them had been extraordinary thinkers, patient and serious and willing to follow an argument wherever it led, had circled the question without quite settling at its center. There was Thales of Miletus, who had lived a century and a half before Aristotle, and who had looked at the world with the particular directness of someone seeing it, as if for the first time, and had decided that water was the fundamental substance from which everything else arose. Everything is water, at the bottom of its nature. The ocean, the cloud, the blood, the stone, all of it water in different configurations. It is an extraordinary thing to sit with, this claim, not because it is correct, but because the impulse behind it is recognizable and genuine. Thales was trying to find the thing beneath all things, the single substance whose transformations account for the multiplicity of the world. He was trying to say, existence is not plural at its deepest level. Beneath the many, there is one. Anaximenes had taken the same impulse and said, not water, but air. Air thickened and rarefied, compressed and released, produces every substance there is, fire when rarefied to its limit, stone and earth when compressed toward theirs. There was something almost musical in this account. The world is a continuous variation on a single substance, playing itself out across every object and organism, and Heraclitus, the most difficult of them, had pointed to fire, not as the material substrate, in the same simple sense, but as the model for what existence itself is like. Everything flows, he said. You cannot step into the same river twice. The fire is the thing that consumes and transforms and never rests. What Heraclitus was doing was something slightly different from Thales and Anaximenes. He was saying that change itself, the constant movement from one thing into another, is the deepest truth about the world. Not a stable substance, but a process. Not a noun, but a verb. They were all, in their different ways, asking the same underlying question. What is the primal stuff? What is the archon, the origin, the underlying principle from which everything that exists has come? They were reaching, imperfectly, towards something that neither the word stuff nor the word origin quite captures, because the question they were really near, but not yet naming, is not only what things are made of, it is why anything exists at all. Those are related questions, but they are not the same question. The first is a question about composition, the second is a question about existence itself, which is a different kind of asking. Parmenides had come closest, perhaps, to the depth of what was being circled. He had insisted on something that sounded, on first hearing, like simple common sense, but which turned out to have consequences no one could easily absorb. Being is, and non-being is not. You cannot think about nothing, because the moment you think about it, it becomes something, the object of your thought. Therefore, nothing does not truly exist, and change, which requires something to pass from being into non-being, is in the end impossible. The world, for Parmenides, is a single, unchanging, undivided whole. The multiplicity we see is illusion. Being is one, and it holds still. This conclusion disturbed nearly everyone who encountered it, because it seemed to require denying the evidence of every sense, and yet the argument that led there was not easy to dismiss. Being is, non-being is not. Where exactly does the argument fail? The question did not resolve quickly. It was this long tradition of circling, Thales, Anaximenes, Heraclitus, Parmenides, and others that Aristotle had absorbed by the time he sat down to write the metaphysics. He knew their arguments with the intimacy of someone who had spent years in actual conversation with them, not merely reading, but thinking through them, testing them, carrying them into his own reflection. And what he had come to feel, with the patience that is the specific discipline of serious philosophy, is that all of these thinkers, even the greatest of them, had been asking what things are made of and how they behave without fully distinguishing that question from a deeper one. They had been asking about substances and their properties. They had not yet asked in the full systematic form the question requires, what it means for anything to be at all. The distinction Aristotle was reaching toward, the one that separates the inquiry his predecessors were conducting from the inquiry he wanted to open, is one of the quietest and most consequential distinctions in the history of thought. It is the difference between the essence of a thing and the mere fact of its existence. These sound like they might be the same. They are not. To know what something is, its structure, its nature, its defining characteristics, the account of what it would be to be that kind of thing, is to know its essence. To know that it is, to know that it exists, that it is among the things that are rather than among the things that are not, is a separate piece of knowledge entirely. And crucially, no amount of the first kind of knowledge automatically gives you the second. Think of it this way. A unicorn can be described with complete precision. One horn, spiraled, rising from the center of the forehead. White coat, hooves that do not quite touch the ground. In the imagination, when the animal moves quickly, mane that catches the light in a particular way. The nature of a unicorn, what it would be to be a unicorn, can be held in the mind with as much clarity as the nature of a horse. But a unicorn does not exist, and a horse standing in an actual field at dawn, its breath visible in the cold air, does exist. The content of their essences, the what they are, does not by itself determine which of them is real. Something additional is required to move from the description to the existence. And that additional thing, that gap between the what and the that, is the opening through which Aristotle's deepest inquiry walks. This is the distinction that his predecessors had approached without fully articulating. Thales' water, Anaximenes' air, Heraclitus' fire. These were answers to the question of what things are, the stuff of their being. They were not yet answers to the question of why there is anything to be made of anything at all. Why is there water rather than nothing? Why is there air, fire, process, flux? Why is there a world in which these substances can move and transform and generate the multiplicity of things rather than nothing, nothing at all? No substances, no transformations, no world, no question, no questioner. That question, in its starkest form, arrived in the history of philosophy as an explicit and stated question at a specific moment in a specific text written by a philosopher who was working almost 2,000 years after Aristotle. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, writing in the year 1714 in a work called Principles of Nature and Grace, set down a sentence that has not been dislodged from philosophy since. Why is there something rather than nothing? He called it the first question we have the right to ask. He was not the first to feel the weight of it, but he was the first to state it in that particular form, with that particular clarity, and to insist that it is not the kind of question that can be dismissed as unanswerable and therefore unimportant. For Leibniz, every contingent fact, every fact that could have been otherwise, requires a sufficient reason, something that explains why it is as it is, rather than otherwise, and the existence of the world is a contingent fact. There is no obvious necessity to its being here. It might, it seems, not have been, and if it might not have been, then the fact that it is requires a reason that goes beyond anything within the world itself. Leibniz was sitting in Hanover when he wrote that sentence, presumably at a desk, presumably late, the ink drying on a page that was going to join the long conversation that Aristotle had formally opened nearly 2 millennia earlier. The specific intellectual position Leibniz was arguing from, the principle of sufficient reason, the notion that nothing happens without a reason why it is so, rather than otherwise, is not identical to Aristotle's framework. Leibniz was working in a different tradition with different assumptions, shaped by Christian theology and by the mathematics he had invented and by the enormous philosophical work of the period between them. But the structural shape of the question he was asking, the conviction that existence is not brute, that it does not simply lie there, demanding no explanation, that the mere fact of there being anything at all is the kind of fact that admits of and demands a rational account. This conviction is one Aristotle would have recognized as his own. There is a difference, and it is a real difference, between the kind of questions that science asks and the kind of question that both Aristotle and Leibniz were asking here. Scientific inquiry is extraordinary in its reach and precision, and in the genuine illumination it provides about the structure of the world. The questions it asks are serious and difficult and consequential, but they share a particular form. They assume that something exists. Matter, energy, space, time, the regularities we call laws, and they ask how things within that existing framework behave, what their properties are, what processes govern their transformations, what is the composition of this substance, how do these forces interact, what was the state of the universe at an earlier time. These are profound questions. They are not the question Aristotle was asking. Aristotle was asking something that lies not within the scope of science, but as he saw it beneath it, not how things within the world behave, assuming they are there, but why there is anything there to assume. The distinction between those two levels of inquiry, between asking how and asking why there is anything to be how, is the distinction between what Aristotle called the particular sciences and what he was calling the science of being qua being. Each particular science takes its domain for granted. Physics takes the physical world for granted. Biology takes living things for granted. Even mathematics, in a certain sense, takes the existence of mathematical objects for granted. What is left, the domain of what Aristotle was calling first philosophy, is the question no particular science can absorb, because no particular science can reach back far enough to ask it without already presupposing an answer. This was the first time in the history of philosophy that this distinction had been drawn with full systematic clarity. It was the articulation of a line between the inquiry into how things are and the inquiry into why there is anything to be that has remained one of the deepest divisions in philosophy and one of the most genuinely hard since the morning Aristotle read those opening words to his students in the cool light of the Lyceum. The difficulty, once the distinction is genuinely felt, is difficult to put back to sleep. It has a particular quality. It is not the same as the difficulty of a puzzle whose solution is merely not yet known, the way a mathematical problem is difficult before the technique for solving it is discovered. It is more like the difficulty of a question that seems to open the floor beneath the other questions, asking what the ground is on which everything else stands. What explains that there is ground at all? The question does not feel threatening, exactly. It feels, for those who have sat with it long enough, more like astonishment, a quiet and very wide astonishment, the kind that does not press for resolution, because the question itself, once it has settled in, is already a kind of answer to the restlessness that philosophy begins in. The Stoics used to speak of a practice of attending to the world as if seeing it for the first time, not because familiarity has distorted the world exactly, but because familiarity has allowed the strangeness to go quiet. The strangeness is still there. Everything around is still strange, in the deep sense, still the kind of thing that need not have been, that exists without obvious necessity, that has arrived at being from some origin that recedes as you look at it. The table in a room at night, the window, the sound of the night outside, all of it exists. All of it is here rather than not here. This fact, just this fact, is enough to hold a mind very still, not in distress, but in something closer to stillness itself, the specific stillness of attention without demand. Aristotle had spent years asking careful questions about very specific things. He had examined the structure of living creatures with the focused attention of someone who believed the world repaid close observation. He had catalogued constitutions of cities, analyzed the forms of rhetoric and tragedy, worked through the principles of logic with sustained and patient precision. He was not a man who held questions at an otherworldly distance. He was a thinker who believed that the world around him was the proper beginning of philosophy, that the structure of an actual leaf, an actual embryo, an actual city was more philosophically valuable than any theory that required leaving the world behind to find its ground. And yet it was this man, this most earthbound and empirical of the great ancient philosophers, who arrived at the question that goes furthest beneath the world, not by leaving it behind, by following it patiently and carefully, all the way down. The question of being, for Aristotle, was not a question that arose from disappointment with the world, from finding it insufficient or unreal or in need of supplementing with something better elsewhere. It arose from attention, from sitting long enough with the world and with what philosophers before him had said about it, to notice that something essential had not yet been named. All those careful accounts of what things are made of, what structures they take, how they change, all of it had been, in a sense, taking the most basic fact about them for granted, that they are, that existence is there to be analyzed and described and explained. Why is existence there at all? Why is their existence to be taken for granted? These two questions sound at a certain speed like the same question. Held more slowly, they separate. The first is a question about particular things, about this substance or that structure. The second is a question about existence itself, about the being in which everything that is participates by simply being. It was the second question, in its full depth and generality, that Aristotle recognized as having gone unanswered. He did not answer it on that morning, reading from the opening of the Metaphysics. He was not announcing a solution, he was naming a question. And in philosophy, naming a question correctly, finding the right form for it, distinguishing it from the neighboring questions it is easy to confuse it with, is already a substantial piece of work. The question once named changes the landscape around it. The other questions, the more particular ones, now stand in a different relation to each other. They all stand on top of something they have not explained. The ground they share remains a question. By the time Leibniz wrote that sentence in 1714, why is there something rather than nothing? Enough centuries had passed that the question had been turned over in many different hands, held in many different philosophical and theological systems, approached through arguments about God's existence, through arguments about the necessity of being, through the medieval debates in which Aristotle's work on essence and existence became one of the central texts. Philosophers had built large and careful structures around the question without resolving it in a way that satisfied everyone who considered it seriously. This is not a failure, or rather, it is a failure only if you expect philosophy to converge on answers the way mathematics converges on proofs. The question of why there is something rather than nothing is not that kind of question. It may be the furthest kind from it. What philosophy does with such a question, what it has been doing with it since Aristotle first gave it its systematic form, is something more like learning to inhabit it, to find the question over the long acquaintance that serious inquiry produces, something that can be lived with rather than lived inside as a source of anxiety. The strangeness of existence, the sheer fact that there is a world and not nothing, does not resolve. It deepens in a way. But the deepening is not distressing for those who have had long enough to sit with it. It becomes the ground of a specific kind of quiet, the kind that comes from recognizing that the most basic fact about the world, that it is there, is a fact that philosophy can approach, can hold carefully, can describe from many angles, can fit into frameworks of greater or lesser coherence, but cannot exhaust, cannot close. The question remains open, the way a clear night sky remains open, not pressing, not urgent, just there above everything, holding everything that exists beneath its very ordinary and entirely inexhaustible presence. On a still night, away from the city and its gathered light, the sky is very large. The stars that are visible, and there are more than the unprepared eye expects, have been burning for periods of time that the mind reaches toward and then releases, unable to hold the full number. Each one of them exists. Whatever they are made of, however they burn, wherever the physical processes that generate their light fall in the long history of the universe, they exist. The space between them exists. The darkness between them, if darkness is a thing rather than an absence, holds them apart. All of it is here rather than not here. The planet on which the night takes place exists. Its ground solid under the long grass, the damp at the edge of a field, or the pavement of a road cut through somewhere cold and quiet. The air that makes breathing possible exists, moving slowly. Aristotle, standing in a garden, pressing his fingers into the soil to examine it, would have been incapable of looking up at that sky without asking what it is made of, what structure underlies it, what principles govern the movements of the stars. He was constitutionally incapable of not asking. That capacity, that refusal to let the world simply lie there without question, is what he meant by the desire to know. It is, he thought, natural. It is in what a human being is. The desire to know is not a project or a discipline. It is a feature of the kind of thing human beings are, present before they know what to do with it, present in the child who watches the world before the child has language for it. And the question toward which that desire, followed faithfully enough and long enough, eventually arrives, the question at the bottom of all the other questions, is not any particular question about any particular thing. It is the question about existence itself, about the being that everything that is has in common just by being, and about why that being is there at all, rather than nothing. The question does not answer itself. The sky does not close into resolution. The night does not explain. But there is a particular quality to the attention with which the question can be held, patient still, without urgency, without the need for the darkness to speak, that Aristotle was the first philosopher to have fully called philosophy. The study of being, just as being, the inquiry that starts not from disappointment or crisis or the need for consolation, but from the simple, wide-open, strangely quiet fact that there is something here rather than nothing, and that this fact alone, turned over slowly in a patient mind on a still night, is enough. The scroll, after the opening sentence, continued for many pages. The argument developed with the careful pace of someone who knew that the subject demanded it. But the opening declaration, all human beings by nature desire to know, was itself, in a sense, already the whole philosophy in miniature, because the desire Aristotle was naming is not finally a desire for answers. It is a desire for the world, for contact with what is real, what actually exists, what it means for anything to be here at all. And the fact that the world exists, that there is something to be in contact with, something to examine and describe and wonder about and follow into its depths, is the most fundamental gift the question can return to, the ground on which every inquiry rests, the beginning that is always available, quiet and inexhaustible, beneath a sky full of things that simply, without explanation, are. Aristotle stopped walking. The Peripatos stretched behind him in the early light, its covered colonnade still holding the cool of the previous night, the stone path soft with the shadows of the pillars. He had been moving through an argument for some time, speaking it aloud as he walked, his students keeping pace beside him. Then he stopped and bent and picked up a leaf from the path. It had fallen from one of the plane trees that grew along the edge of the walkway. It was brown at the edges and still faintly green at its center, the veins still visible, the stem still faintly flexible between his fingers. He turned it over once. Then he looked at the student nearest to him and asked a question that had nothing to do with what it was made of. What would it mean, he asked, to fully explain this? Not to name its parts, not to say, this is cellulose, this is moisture, this is the cellular structure of a plane tree's seasonal growth. Those things might all be said, and said accurately, and still something would remain unexplained. The leaf in his hand had a material, but it also had a shape that made it a leaf, rather than a smear of the same matter pressed between stones. It had come from somewhere, from a bud, from a branch, from the long, slow work of a growing season, and it had grown the way it grew for a reason, or at least in the direction of something, toward the light and air that sustained the tree of which it had been, until this morning, a functioning part. 4 things, Aristotle said, and he held the leaf a moment longer before setting it down on the stone path and resuming his walk. The question of what it means to fully explain something is older than philosophy's name for it. Long before Aristotle picked up that leaf, thinkers had been looking at the world and trying to identify what stood beneath its surface. What one thing or few things were responsible for the overwhelming variety of what appeared. Thales had said water, Anaximenes had said air. Heraclitus had pointed at fire and at the flux that fire made visible. These were serious answers to a serious question, and they were not entirely wrong. The world is made of something. Whatever that something is, it underlies and persists through the changes that happen at the surface of things. But Aristotle had looked at these answers and had found them incomplete in a way he could name precisely. Knowing what a thing is made of tells you only what it could be. It does not tell you what it actually is, or what brought it into being, or what it is for. A block of bronze could become a statue, or a doorstep, or a weapon, or a cooking pot. The bronze itself tells you nothing about which of these it will become, or why. Something else is needed, several things else, in fact, and none of them can be omitted without leaving the explanation hollow at its center. The framework Aristotle developed to address this sits at the heart of his natural philosophy. He called the elements of a complete explanation causes iti, though the Greek word carries a meaning slightly wider than the English one. A cause, for Aristotle, was not only what produced an effect, it was any of the fundamental ways in which a thing's existence could be illuminated and accounted for. To know all four causes of a thing was, in his view, to know that thing as fully as it could be known. To know fewer was to hold only a partial picture, however accurate the portion in hand. He taught this in the Lyceum through examples, through statues and houses and animals and plants, through the visible, touchable, ordinary world he had learned to pay attention to long before he had learned to name what he was looking at. The first cause was the one that came most naturally to his predecessors and to nearly everyone who picks up the question for the first time. What is something made of? What is the underlying stuff, the substrate, the raw material that was shaped and worked and organized into the thing we now perceive? Aristotle called this the material cause, hyle, the word for timber, for the raw stuff of construction, bronze in the case of a statue, wood and stone in the case of a house, flesh and bone and fluid in the case of a living body, earth and water and air and whatever chemistry of the soil and season brings them together in the case of the leaf. The material cause is real. It matters. Nothing can exist without being made of something, and what it is made of shapes what it can and cannot be, or do, or become. Bronze cracks differently from marble. A body built from carbon behaves differently from one built from iron. The material of a thing is not incidental to it. And yet Aristotle was clear on this. The material cause, taken alone, explains almost nothing. It tells you what a thing could be. It says nothing about what it is. Two objects sat, perhaps on a shelf in the Lyceum. One was a small bronze figure of Hermes, the god in mid-stride, his weight on one foot, his arm raised, the face calm and alert. The other was a bronze doorstop, a simple wedge, smooth and featureless, the sort of thing used to hold a door open in a courtyard. Identical material, the same alloy of copper and tin, worked by the same fires, quarried perhaps from the same vein of ore, in the same mine somewhere in the Aegean hills. If the material cause were sufficient to explain a thing, these two objects would be the same object. Clearly they are not. Something else distinguishes them, something that has nothing to do with what they are made of, and everything to do with what they are. Aristotle called this the formal cause, eidos, or morphe, and it was here that his deepest argument with Plato came into focus. Plato had also recognized that form was essential to explanation. He had insisted that what makes a horse, and not some other assemblage of flesh and bone, is not the matter, but the form, the essential structure that the particular horse participates in or copies imperfectly. But Plato had drawn this form out of the world entirely. For Plato, the form of the horse existed in a separate, eternal, immaterial realm, of which the horse standing in the field was a mere shadow, a copy, a pale reflection of the original. The form was real. The horse was almost real. Aristotle had sat with this and had not been able to follow it. Not because the argument was wrong about the importance of form. It was right about that. But because a form that exists separately from the things that have it cannot do the work of explanation that forms are supposed to do. A form hovering in an abstract realm, entirely disconnected from matter and change and the ongoing life of the world. How does such a form make a horse a horse? How does it account for what the horse actually is, here, now, breathing and moving and eating and growing? The connection between the transcendent form and the particular thing was, in Aristotle's view, precisely what Plato's theory failed to provide. So Aristotle placed the form back inside the thing. The form of a horse is not a separate entity somewhere else. It is the organizing structure immanent in this horse, the pattern of biological organization that makes its cells arrange themselves into hooves and muscles and eyes and the particular shape of its skull, rather than into the shape of a fish or a stone. The formal cause is what a thing is, not what it is made of, and it is present in the thing itself, inseparable from the matter that embodies it, neither existing without the other, both together constituting the actual living being. The bronze figure of Hermes has a formal cause, the specific shape, the proportions, the arrangement of limbs, and expression that make it a representation of this god rather than an arbitrary lump. The leaf has a formal cause, the venation pattern, the shape of its margin, the cellular organization that makes it function as a photosynthetic surface for a plain tree rather than as an undifferentiated scrap of organic matter. The formal cause is the answer to the question, what is this specifically, as opposed to everything else it could have been made from the same matter. Neither of these two causes, even taken together, is sufficient. A block of bronze with a form in mind, even a very clear and detailed form, does not become a statue by itself. Something has to act, someone has to work the metal. Aristotle called this the efficient cause, the archites kineso, the origin of motion or change. The sculptor who carves the marble, the parent whose body generates the child, the seed whose chemistry initiates the growth of the plant. In living things, the efficient cause is often internal. The organism itself, through its biological processes, brings about its own development. In artifacts, the efficient cause is typically external. The craftsman who shapes the material with a specific form in mind, working from outside the material toward the goal it cannot achieve on its own. This is the cause that modern scientific thinking tends to find most familiar. Mechanism, in the scientific sense, is largely a study of efficient causes, of what processes produce, what effects, what forces generate what changes, what chemical reactions follow from what initial conditions. Aristotle had recognized this dimension of explanation and had given it its rightful place. He did not dismiss it, he simply refused to let it stand alone. An explanation that accounts for only the material of a thing and the process that shaped it, even a very precise and detailed account of both, still has not answered the deepest question. It has said what a thing is made of and how it came to be, but not what it is for. That question belongs to the fourth cause. Of the four, the final cause, telos, the end, the purpose, was the one Aristotle considered most important. It was also the one most likely to encounter resistance, both in his own time and in the centuries that followed. To say that a thing has a purpose, a direction, a natural end toward which it is oriented, this is to say something about the world that is either obviously true or deeply questionable, depending on where one begins. Aristotle began from observation, from the close attention to living things that he had spent years cultivating, and from that ground the teleological character of the natural world seemed not like a philosophical commitment imposed on nature from outside, but like the most obvious feature of what he actually saw. A heart beats. It does not beat randomly, or incidentally, or as a side effect of some other process. Its beating is what it is for. The entire extraordinary complexity of cardiac muscle, the four chambers and their valves, and the electrical coordination that keeps them working in sequence. All of this exists in the service of the heart's function, which is the circulation of blood through the body that sustains the body's life. To explain the heart without explaining what it does and what that doing is for, to give only the material cause and the efficient cause, is to leave the most important thing unsaid. The heart makes sense because of its function. Its function is not a fact, added onto the heart's explanation after the fact. The function is the explanation. Without it, the anatomy is a curiosity, not a comprehension. This was the argument Aristotle pressed. In the natural world, things are not random assemblages of matter that happen through some accident of physics to have acquired the structures they have. They are organized for something. A bird's wing is organized for flight. An eye is organized for vision. A root is organized for the absorption of water and nutrients from the soil. This organization is not imposed from outside. It is internal. It is what the thing is, and the final cause, the end that the thing is organized toward, is not a purpose someone else had for it. It is the thing's own natural completion, the state of being fully what it is. In the Lyceum, Aristotle might have illustrated this with almost anything. He had spent years collecting and observing. There were specimens on the shelves, dried plants, preserved animals, careful anatomical notes. The entire project of the Lyceum was, among other things, a sustained empirical investigation of the natural world in its full variety, driven by the conviction that every part of that variety, looked at carefully enough, would reveal the teleological structure that Aristotle's philosophy predicted. But the simplest illustration is the one that needs no shelf at all. A seed. Not yet the oak, not the tree in the field, throwing shade across the morning grass. The seed, which is small and hard and brown, and which, if held in the hand, tells you almost nothing about what it will become. Tells you almost nothing, that is, unless you know how to ask all four questions at once. What is this made of? Carbon? Water? The complex chemistry of plant life concentrated into a hard coat of cellulose, and stored energy, and tightly coiled biological information. The material cause is present. It accounts for what is actually here in the hand, this dense potential-laden weight. What is this, specifically? An acorn, not a pebble, not a grain of wheat, not a hazelnut. An acorn with the specific formal organization that distinguishes an acorn from every other small hard thing in the world, the distinctive shape, the cap, and beneath the cap, the full biological blueprint for a particular kind of tree. The formal cause is present inside the seed, not as an abstract plan existing somewhere separately, but as the actual organization of the seed's living substance. What brought this here? The oak that produced it, which had its own efficient cause, and before that, another oak, in an unbroken sequence of generating causes stretching back through time. The efficient cause, the generative activity of the parent tree, the mechanics of reproduction and dispersal, is present in the history of how this acorn came to be, lying in the path. And what is this for? Here is where the question gets most interesting, and where Aristotle's answer is most distinctive. The acorn is for the oak, not for a human use, not for the purposes of a forest ecosystem, not for anything outside itself. The acorn is for the oak, because the oak is what the acorn, left to its proper conditions, becomes. The oak is the acorn's telos, its end, its full realization, the complete expression of what the acorn most truly is. The acorn doesn't become an oak by accident. It doesn't become an oak because someone wants it to. It becomes an oak because that is the direction of its own internal nature. The telos is not imposed from outside. It is what the thing is pointed toward from within. The student standing beside Aristotle on the Peripatos, listening to this argument for the first time, might have found the fourth cause the hardest to hold in mind. It asks something that the first three causes do not. It asks not what a thing is made of, or how it came to be, or what form it bears, but what its existence is for, in the deepest, most internal, most constitutive sense of that word. And it answers that question by pointing not to something outside the thing, but to something within it, the full realization of its nature, the actualization of what it most essentially is, the end that is already present, obscurely and potentially, in every stage of its becoming. Aristotle did not mean this as a metaphor. He meant it as an account of how the natural world actually works. Living things develop the way they do because they are organized toward ends. Those ends are not externally imposed. They are the form of the thing, seen from the temporal direction of its full realization. The acorn is formal, cause seen in the present. The oak is formal cause seen as destination. They are the same thing, the same organizing principle at different stages of a continuous unfolding. To understand this fully, one has to hold all four causes simultaneously, as aspects of a single explanation, rather than as four separate and competing accounts. The material, the formal, the efficient, the final. These are not four different answers to four different questions. They are four dimensions of a single complete answer to one question. What is this? Not what is it made of, or only that, but what is it fully, in all the ways its existence can be illuminated. Aristotle taught this on his walks, in his conversations, in the thousands of pages he left behind. Though those pages came to us not as polished writings, but as the dense, demanding notes of a working philosopher, arguments in their workshop form rather than their public dress. The four causes appear in the physics, in the parts of animals, in the metaphysics, in the generation of animals, in text after text, across the full range of his inquiry into the natural world. Not because he repeated himself for want of new ideas, but because the fourfold framework was his instrument for thinking, and the variety of what he applied it to was inexhaustible. A house, he said, the bricks and timber and stone, the material cause. The plan of the house, the structure of its rooms and walls and roof, the formal cause. The builders and their labor, the efficient cause. Shelter, warmth, a place for human life to be lived, the final cause. No single one of these, nor any three without the fourth, constitutes a complete account of why a house is what it is. Together they do. Together they leave nothing essential unexplained. A doctor treating a patient. The patient's body, with its tissues and fluids and organs, the material cause. The state of health that defines what this body, specifically, is capable of being, the formal cause. The treatment administered, the medicines given, the rest prescribed, the efficient cause. The recovery of the patient, the restoration of the body's natural functioning, the final cause. Aristotle had grown up watching a physician work. He understood that medicine without a concept of health, without a telos, a natural end that the body is organized toward, and that the treatment aims to restore, is not medicine at all. It is only intervention. The final cause is what gives the intervention its direction and meaning. Without it, even the most technically accomplished treatment lacks the orientation that makes it healing rather than merely changing. He returned to animals. He returned to plants. He wrote at length about the octopus and the sea urchin and the bee. He was not, in these passages, showing off his observational range. He was demonstrating, case by case, that the teleological structure of the living world was not an abstract philosophical claim, but a description of what anyone would find who looked carefully and honestly at the actual organized complexity of living things. Every organ, every behavior, every developmental process bore the marks of organization toward an end. The form and the final cause were not two separate things. They were the same principle, viewed from two different angles, what a thing is and what its being that is for. A student once asked, or at any rate, we can imagine such a student, in such a room, on such a morning, whether the final cause was not simply a story told about nature after the fact. Whether, once the material and the efficient causes were fully understood, the final cause would dissolve into them, shown to be not a genuine feature of the world, but only a convenient narrative imposed on what were really just physical processes running their course. Aristotle's answer, worked out across many texts rather than in a single exchange, was careful and steady. He was not claiming that nature has intentions in the way a craftsman has intentions. He was not saying that the acorn chooses to become an oak. He was saying that the organization of the acorn is not intelligible without reference to the oak, that the specific structure of the seed, its stored energy, its genetic blueprint, its hard protective coat, makes sense only when understood in relation to the living organism they are organized to produce. To remove the final cause from the explanation is not to achieve greater rigor. It is to leave the explanation incomplete in a way that a rigorous thinker should find unsatisfying. The pre-Socratics had been rigorous in their way. They had looked at the overwhelming diversity of the world and had asked what single substance could underlie it all. Water, air, fire. They were asking a real question and getting partial answers. The material cause was what they were reaching for, and they were reaching in the right direction. But they had not yet distinguished the question of what things are from the question of what brings them into being, or from the question of what they are for. These distinctions were Aristotle's contribution, not the invention of a new question, but the careful analysis of a question that had been circling, incompletely formed from the beginning. Later thinkers would take the framework in different directions. Medieval philosophers would use the final cause to argue for a divine intelligence ordering the natural world. The idea that organized complexity implies an organizer, that the teleological structure of living things points toward a mind that intended that structure, was not Aristotle's argument, but his framework made it available. He had said that natural things were organized toward ends. He had said that this organization was internal, not imposed from outside by a craftsman. But the argument was malleable in other hands. It could be turned outward. It could be made to point beyond the thing itself, to something else that had endowed it with its form and its telos. Aristotle himself had not followed the argument in this direction, at least not here, not in the context of the four causes. He left the framework as a description of nature. Others would use it as an argument towards something beyond nature. Modern biology, it should be said, had a complicated relationship with the final cause. There were centuries during which the official position of natural philosophy was that final causes had no place in science, that genuine explanation was mechanical, efficient, material, and nothing more. The teleological language that crept into biological description, the heart pumps blood in order to circulate it, the eye is designed for vision, was treated as a convenient shorthand for something that could, in principle, be cashed out in purely mechanical terms. Aristotle was a figure to be overcome, an ancient authority whose grip had to be loosened before science could move forward. And then, slowly, the picture became more complex. Darwin's account of natural selection gave evolutionary biology a way of thinking about function and purpose that was both entirely naturalistic and genuinely teleological in Aristotle's sense. The eye is for vision. This is not an idle metaphor in evolutionary biology. It is a claim about the history and organization of a structure, about what it does and why it's doing, that accounts for its continued presence in the lineage. The formal and final causes did not vanish from biological explanation. They reappeared in a new form, wearing new clothes, doing the same explanatory work that Aristotle had first identified them to do. He would have recognized what was happening even across the vast distance of time and conceptual change. He had been watching living things do what living things do, and he had named the structure of that doing carefully enough that the name survived. In the Lyceum, the morning continued. The light on the parapatos moved slowly as the sun climbed. The conversation moved with it, through the bronze figure and the doorstop, through the leaf, through the house and the doctor and the acorn. The students would have written down what they could. The notes would circulate. The arguments would be refined in evening lectures and morning walks and the long afternoon hours in the library. The framework was not fixed and delivered complete from above. It was worked out, tested against examples, revised, pressed to its limits, and then pressed a little further. The leaf on the path lay where Aristotle had set it down. No one had picked it up again. By afternoon, if someone noticed it, it would have dried a little further, the green at its center fading, the veins still there, the shape still recognizably a plane tree's leaf, its formal cause intact, even as its material cause slowly dispersed back into the ground. A complete explanation of that leaf would have to account for all of this, for what it was made of, for the form that made it this particular leaf, and not some other configuration of organic matter, for the tree that produced it, and the growing season that shaped it, and for the work it had done and was no longer doing, gathering light, producing the sugars that fed the tree, sustaining for one season the life it was part of. 4 things, Aristotle had said, and he had picked it up and turned it over and set it down again and walked on. The oak tree at the edge of the field, not the leaf on the path now, but the tree the leaf came from, the tree that stands in early light with its roots below the soil and its crown wide against the sky, does not look like a philosophical problem. It looks like a tree. It looks ordinary and solid and undemanding of explanation. The bark has its texture. The roots have their particular gnarled architecture at the base of the trunk. The branches reach in the ways that branches reach, shaped by wind and light and the long, slow accumulation of years. But to hold all 4 causes in mind while looking at the tree is to see it differently, not to see less, or to reduce it to a set of philosophical categories. The opposite, to see more, to see the material cause, and recognize that the specific chemistry of wood and bark and leaf is what makes it capable of being an oak rather than some other kind of living thing. To see the formal cause and recognize that the form of the oak, the pattern of its branching, the shape of its leaves, the structure of its root system, the organization of its cellular biology, is what makes it an oak and not an elm, a stone, a stream. To see the efficient cause and recognize that behind the tree, standing now in the morning light, there is a long sequence of causes, the acorn that germinated, the centuries of oaks before it, the soil conditions, and the seasonal cycles, and the water moving through the ground. And to see the final cause and recognize that the tree's growth, its reaching upward and outward, its development of deep roots and wide branches and seasonal cycles of dormancy and flourishing, all of this is oriented toward the full expression of what an oak is, the complete actualization of what has been present in potential since the first cell of the seedling divided in the dark beneath the soil. The tree does not look solved when seen this way. It looks more present, more itself. The 4 causes do not explain the tree away. They are the shape of the attention that the tree rewards, when that attention is careful enough to follow all 4 dimensions of its existence rather than 1 or 2. That is, perhaps what Aristotle meant by complete explanation, not the removal of the thing's existence into a set of abstract categories, the deepening of one's capacity to be present to what is actually there. The leaf picked up and turned over, the question asked in all its dimensions, the leaf set down again, and the tree still standing in the field, exactly as it was, and somehow more fully itself, for having been attended to with the full range of questions that its existence and any existence deserves. Aristotle unrolled the scroll of his physics in the lamplit room and began to read the argument aloud, his voice steady and unhurried, each step following the last with the patience of someone who has no interest in arriving quickly. The lamp threw a low circle of light across the papyrus. Outside, the Parapetos was dark, the grove of Apollo Lycia still. The argument he was reading was one he had written himself, and still he read it aloud, because some arguments need to be heard before they can be fully trusted, and this one carried a weight that deserved the slow passage of spoken words through air. The argument began simply, things move. This much could not be doubted. A stone falls, a flame rises, a child grows from infancy to walking, seasons arrive and turn, and are replaced. The whole of the visible world is a world in motion, a continuous unfolding, one thing becoming another, with a patience and regularity that suggests not randomness, but something like necessity. And so the question Aristotle was asking was not whether things move, but what finally accounts for the motion, not any particular motion, all of it. The question underneath every explanation, the question that does not disappear when any single answer is given. Every moving thing, he read, is moved by something. The falling stone is moved by the conditions of its nature and the earth below it. The growing child is moved by the form it carries inward, the form that draws it from what it is toward what it is becoming. The river is moved by the lay of the land, the rain, the slow pull of lower ground. Everywhere one looked, motion arrived from somewhere. It did not arise from nothing. It did not proceed without origin. And so one could ask, working backward from any given motion, what moved the thing that produced it, and then what moved that, and then what moved that, and then what moved that. This backward movement is not a small inquiry. It is the beginning of a long philosophical path that many had started and few had followed all the way to its end. The pre-Socratic philosophers had walked some distance along it, asking what the fundamental substance of the world was, what the original material might be from which all things arose. Water, some said, air, fire, but Aristotle had seen, working through their answers one by one, that naming the original material of things did not explain why the material moves, why it arranges itself into forms, why the world is not simply a vast inert expanse of stuff lying motionless in permanent silence. The material answer is always partial. It answers one question and leaves another in its place. The answer he had arrived at, working through years of careful argument, revising and refining, was not a material answer. It was not the name of a substance or an element. It was a structural conclusion, a place at which the logic of the question itself compelled the philosopher to stop and acknowledge what had to be there, not because it was visible or tangible, but because without it, the whole account of motion and change collapsed into incoherence. To understand what Aristotle found at the end of that inquiry, it is necessary to stay with the question of infinite regress for a moment, not because the argument is difficult, but because it is easy to pass over it too quickly, to agree with it on the surface before its full weight has been felt. Imagine a sequence of causes. One thing moves another, which moves another, which moves another. The sequence could in principle be extended without limit, each cause requiring a prior cause, each explanation requiring a deeper explanation, each mover having itself been moved by something before it. The question is whether such a sequence, extended without end, constitutes a genuine explanation. Aristotle thought not. A series in which every member requires a prior member outside itself to account for its being in motion cannot, taken as a whole, explain why there is any motion in the series at all. The explanation has simply been deferred at each step, pushed backward without ever being completed. A sequence of borrowed explanations does not add up to an explanation. This is the argument Aristotle was reading by lamplight, and he read it slowly, because slowly is the only honest pace for an argument that claims to reach all the way down. What was needed, what the logic of the argument demanded, was a cause that was not itself caused, a mover that was not itself moved. Not because this satisfied some intuitive preference for a first beginning, but because the alternative, the infinite regress, left the question of motion unanswered at a depth where it needed to be answered. The regress does not explain motion, it merely names the problem in a longer form. What then does it mean for something to be moved without itself being moved, to be, as Aristotle put it, the unmoved mover? The phrase has the shape of a paradox, but for Aristotle it was not paradoxical. It was the logical consequence of thinking clearly about what causation, finally, requires. And to understand it, one has to look past the most obvious model of causation, the model of one billiard ball striking another, one force applied to a passive recipient, and consider a different kind of causation entirely. A causation that works not through impact or force, but through something older and quieter than either of those. Aristotle reached for an image. He had always trusted images when arguments risked becoming too thin, too drained of the sensory weight that made them believable. The image he reached for was one that required no philosophical training to recognize. Think of someone standing still. He might have said to a student walking beside him in the early evening, while another person crosses the room toward them. Not pushed, not commanded, drawn. The one who stands still does nothing, does not reach, does not move, does not exert force in any mechanical sense, and yet the motion of the one crossing the room is entirely on account of that stillness, that presence, that whatever it is that draws without moving. The beloved moves the lover, not by force, but by being what it is. This image is not a metaphor for the unmoved mover. It is for Aristotle a description of the kind of causation the unmoved mover actually exercises. The deepest kind of movement in the world is not the movement of impact and force, but the movement of desire and attraction, the movement of things drawn toward what they are not yet, but are already oriented toward. A seed drawn toward the form it carries within itself, a mind drawn toward understanding, a cosmos drawn, in its great wheeling motion, toward something it can approach but never reach, in the way that a moving thing can reach and touch a stationary one, because what draws it is not in the world, but at the outermost edge of it, unchanging, sufficient unto itself, the still point around which all becoming turns. The unmoved mover, in Aristotle's account, is described not as a mechanical origin, not as the first push in a long line of pushes, but as the ground of all causal activity. The reason the whole series of causes has the character it has, rather than being a mere indefinite sequence of events, with no structure and no direction. It is what makes the world a cosmos rather than a chaos, an ordered whole rather than a scattered accident. And it achieves this not by intervening, not by reaching into the world from outside, but simply by being what it is, so completely, so entirely, without lack or incompleteness, that everything in the world which has any orientation at all is oriented in some ultimate sense toward it. In the Lyceum, working late in the evenings when the students had gone and the corridors were empty, Aristotle pushed the argument further. If the unmoved mover is genuinely uncaused, if it is not in motion, not in the process of becoming something it is not yet, not subject to change or alteration, then it must be entirely actual, no potential remaining unfulfilled, no capacity waiting for its exercise, no future state toward which it is even now inclining. Everything it could be, it already is. Everything it is completely and without remainder. This is what Aristotle meant by pure actuality, by the claim that the unmoved mover contains no admixture of potentiality. The terms carry a technical weight that can be allowed to rest here at the surface rather than being pulled fully into view, but the idea they carry is not difficult to feel. Anything that could be otherwise than it is contains within itself a gap between what it is and what it could become. That gap is what makes change possible, and also what makes it necessary, what makes every changing thing a thing in process, a thing not yet arrived at the full realization of what it is. The unmoved mover has no such gap. There is no distance between what it is and what it is fully capable of being. It does not move toward its own completion because it has no completion to move toward. It simply is, entirely, without remainder. There is something almost impossible to hold in thought here. The effort to imagine a thing that is complete without limitation, not merely very large or very powerful or very long-lasting, but genuinely without the structure of incompleteness that characterizes everything visible, runs against the habits of a mind formed in the company of changing things. Everything one knows is in some sense reaching, trees reaching toward light, water reaching toward level, children reaching toward the forms of language and understanding they do not yet possess. To imagine something that does not reach, that rests entirely in its own completed being, is to imagine something that has no analogy in the visible world, and yet the argument insists it must be there. Aristotle did not stop at pure actuality. He asked a further question. If the unmoved mover is pure actuality, entirely complete, without lack or incompleteness, then what is its activity? What does something that cannot change, cannot grow, cannot desire anything it does not already possess, actually do? The answer he gave was one of the most austere and extraordinary in the history of philosophy. Its activity is thought, not thought about the world, because the world is composed of changing contingent things, and to think about them would be to be in some relation of dependence upon them, would be to require them for one's thinking. Not thought about some object outside itself, because anything outside itself would be lesser, incomplete, and to depend on a lesser object for one's thinking would introduce a deficiency into what must be entirely self-sufficient. The unmoved mover thinks itself. Its activity is thought-thinking thought, a self-referential, self-completing contemplation in which the thinker, the act of thinking, and the object of thought are not three separate things, but a single, unbroken actuality. This is noesios. Noesios, the phrase belongs to Aristotle's Metaphysics, to the 12th book, sometimes called Book Lambda, where the argument about the unmoved mover reaches its fullest development. The Greek is worth keeping in mind simply for the way it sounds, noesis, noeseos, because even before its meaning is fully unpacked, the sound of it does something that pure philosophical exposition cannot always do. It suggests the quality of the thing it names, a thought that turns back on itself, that needs no outside object, that moves in a perfect circle from which nothing escapes and into which nothing needs to be imported. To hold this image without distortion, it helps to think of a simpler parallel. Consider what it is like to be genuinely absorbed in a thought, not thinking about something external, not working through a problem that requires consulting the world, but thinking clearly about the nature of thinking itself, following the movement of mind as it gathers and holds and turns a question over in pure attention. There are moments in philosophical inquiry when the thinking seems to become transparent to itself, when the thought and the awareness of the thought converge into a single activity without division. Aristotle was pointing towards something like that experience and claiming that for the unmoved mover, that convergence is not a rare moment within an ordinary life of distraction and drift, but the permanent and complete condition of its existence. Thought aware of itself as thought, not a reaching toward understanding, but understanding that rests entirely in its own activity, the way a flame rests in its own burning. The great spheres of Aristotle's cosmos turn in their eternal rhythm around the earth at the center, each one nested within another, the outermost sphere carrying the fixed stars in their stately rotation across the night. That outermost sphere turns not because it is pushed from outside. There is no outside for Aristotle beyond that last boundary, but because it is drawn in the deep structural sense that his account of causation establishes, toward the unmoved mover at the still center of all becoming. The turning is eternal. It has always been happening and will always continue. There was no moment when it began, no first revolution from which the rest followed. The motion is as permanent as the mover that grounds it, a perpetual procession of the cosmos around its own deepest cause. This is an image that can be held at some distance from the argument and still carry its essential quality. The vastness of the turning sky, the slow sweep of the fixed stars across the dark in the hours before dawn, all of it in motion, continuous and unhurried, the motion not arriving from any visible source, but sustained by something that has no location in the world. It moves because it is not in the world at all, in the way that things in motion are in the world. It is the ground beneath the world, the reason there is a world rather than silence. Aristotle's students who heard this argument for the first time would have arrived at this point in the inquiry, carrying a long history of philosophical thinking about divine things. The gods of the old tradition were beings who intervened, who desired, who took offense and offered favor, who were moved by sacrifice and prayer. Even the Platonic tradition had imagined a demiurge, a divine craftsman who shaped the world according to the eternal forms, a being who acted, who decided, who looked at the forms and then at the disordered matter and brought the two together in an act of productive intention. Aristotle's unmoved mover shares almost nothing with either of these pictures. It does not intervene. It does not shape or craft or decide. It does not know the world, does not care about the world, does not hear the world's appeals. Its sole activity is the perfect self-contemplation of its own fully actualized being. It moves the cosmos not by paying attention to it, but by being what it is, complete, self-sufficient, present to its own nature, with a fullness that nothing in the world of change and becoming can fully achieve. There is something in this vision that is genuinely difficult to reconcile with the religious impulse, with the desire for a divine presence that knows and cares, that listens and responds, that is in some meaningful relation to the particular lives of those who turn toward it. Aristotle himself seems not to have been troubled by this. His argument was not designed to answer the prayers of anyone. It was designed to complete the account of why there is motion at all, and the unmoved mover is the conclusion demanded by that account, not a figure drawn to meet any prior expectation. This is part of what made Aristotle's philosophy both irresistible and deeply challenging to the medieval Christian thinkers who encountered it in Latin translation, filtered through centuries of commentary and preservation. The argument was extraordinary. The precision of the reasoning, the elegance of the conclusion, the way the causal logic pressed inevitably toward a first principle of pure actuality, all of this compelled genuine philosophical admiration. And yet the God it arrived at was not the God of Scripture, not the Creator who spoke the world into being from nothing, not the Father who heard petitions and responded with providential care. Thomas Aquinas, working in the 13th century in the great Dominican school at Cologne and later at Paris, read Aristotle with a combination of intellectual reverence and theological precision that few before or after him have managed to sustain. He saw in the unmoved mover the distant shape of an argument he could, with care and patience, bring into alignment with the God of Christian faith. But he understood that the alignment required more than simple identification. It required philosophical work. Aquinas, at his desk in Paris, the scrolls and codices of Aristotle's metaphysics spread before him, alongside the texts of the Church Fathers, was doing something genuinely difficult, trying to hold two enormous intellectual traditions in a single careful mind, and to see where they touched and where they did not. He followed Aristotle's argument about the first cause of motion and accepted it as sound, but he also brought to it a theological principle that Aristotle had not required and had not used. For Aquinas, the first cause of motion was not merely the uncaused cause of all change, it was also, and more fundamentally, the cause of existence itself. Not merely the ground of why things move, but the ground of why there is anything to move at all. This move from Aristotle's first cause of motion to what Aquinas called ipsum esse subsistence, pure subsisting existence itself, was not a small adjustment. Aristotle's unmoved mover moves an eternal cosmos that has always existed and will always exist. It does not create the cosmos. It does not give it being. It simply draws it in its perpetual motion toward the still ground of pure actuality. For Aquinas, the God who is ipsum esse subsistence is the reason there is a cosmos at all, the reason there is existence rather than nothing, the ground not merely of motion, but of being as such. Aristotle's argument provided the logical structure. Aquinas filled it with a theological content that Aristotle's own text did not contain. This is not a criticism of Aquinas. The transformation was careful and acknowledged, and the result was one of the most ambitious intellectual syntheses in the history of thought. But it is worth holding the distinction in view, because Aristotle and Aquinas were asking questions at slightly different levels, and the difference is philosophically significant. Aristotle was asking why there is motion. Aquinas was asking, in part, why there is anything. The second question contains the first, but is not contained by it, and the answer that serves one question does not automatically serve the other without additional work. The unmoved mover, as Aristotle conceived it, sits at the boundary of the cosmos, perfect and self-sufficient, drawing the eternal spheres in their rotation, sustaining through its pure actuality the ordered motion of a world that has always been in motion and will always continue. This is a vision of considerable serenity, not the serenity of emptiness or vacancy, but the serenity of something so complete that nothing is lacking, a perfection that rests in itself without reaching toward anything outside itself, because there is nothing outside itself that it needs. To imagine the cosmos from this perspective standing, as it were, at the outermost edge of what is, looking inward at the great nested spheres turning in their eternal rhythm, each one drawing from the still point at the center of all becoming the energy of its perpetual motion, is to imagine a world that is not running down, not arriving towards some final exhaustion, but sustained in its activity by a principle that does not diminish, does not tire, does not alter. The motion of the heavens, for Aristotle, is not evidence of mechanical forces acting on passive matter, but the visible expression of a universe oriented toward its own deepest ground, drawn, in the way that everything that moves is drawn, toward what is most fully and completely real. There is a thought that tends to arise when an argument of this kind reaches its end. The thought is something like, does this help? Does arriving at the unmoved mover, understanding it as pure actuality and self-thinking thought, actually answer the question of why anything exists? Or has the argument produced something so rarefied, so emptied of the ordinary features of causation and existence, that it has arrived at something that stands at the edge of what can be meaningfully said? Aristotle's answer, had he been asked, might have been that this is exactly what one should expect when one follows the question of existence all the way down. At the ordinary scale of inquiry, causes look like pushes and pulls, forces and conditions, substances undergoing change. But the question of why there is existence at all, the question of why there is motion rather than stillness, why there is a cosmos rather than void, these questions do not live at the ordinary scale. They live at the edge of what natural inquiry can reach, and at that edge, the answer must take the form of something that does not share the structure of the things it explains. A cause that is itself caused solves nothing at the deepest level. An explanation that requires a further explanation is not an explanation of the thing it was supposed to explain, but merely a description of the company it keeps. The unmoved mover is strange by ordinary standards. It is strange in precisely the way that a genuine first principle must be strange, because it is the limit of a regress, and limits do not share the character of what they limit. This strangeness is not a weakness of the argument. It is, in a sense, its deepest honesty, the acknowledgement that the question of existence, followed seriously enough, arrives somewhere that ordinary categories do not fully cover, somewhere that requires the philosopher to hold the conclusion with patience and allow it to be what it is, even when what it is resists easy visualization. The lamp in Aristotle's workroom burned low as the argument came to its end. He set the scroll aside with the care of someone who has spent a long time on something and is now allowing it to rest. The conclusion was not triumphant. It had the quality of something arrived at through necessity rather than choice, something that had been there waiting at the end of the inquiry long before the inquiry began. The world moves. The movement requires a ground that does not move. The ground that does not move must be pure actuality, without lack, without potential, without the structure of incompleteness that belonging to the world would require. Its activity is thought thinking itself, and this, finally, is what holds the cosmos in its motion, not a force from outside, not a push or a pull in the mechanical sense, but a presence so complete that all motion in the world of becoming is in some ultimate sense the turning of things toward it. Outside the workroom, the peripapatos was dark and still. The grove of trees around the Lyceum held the night in its branches. The stars that Aristotle could have seen from the doorway were the same stars whose motion he had been thinking about all evening, moving in their slow arcs across the sky, drawing their circles with the unhurried regularity of something that has been doing this for longer than any human memory reaches. each arc a line drawn around the still point, each revolution a reminder that the world has an orientation, that motion is not shapeless or arbitrary, that the whole of the visible cosmos is in some sense inclined toward what it cannot be, but toward which it perpetually turns. The outermost sphere of Aristotle's cosmos continues its eternal rotation in the imagination, the way things continue in the imagination, when an argument has made them vivid, not as a literal picture of the sky, but as a quality of the thinking itself, a sense that the question of motion has found, not its end, but the most honest resting place available to a mind that has followed it without flinching, vast and silent, drawn in its turning by something that does not turn and does not need to, sustained not by force, but by the deep structural pull of orientation toward what is most fully and completely real. The unmoved mover stands, if standing is even the right word, at no location in the world it grounds, present to nothing outside itself, thinking only itself, its perfection so complete that the cosmos is warm with it, is in motion with it, is arranged around it, the way all motion arranges itself around the ground that makes motion possible. This is a presence so complete that it requires nothing, a light that does not diminish, a thought that does not drift. And the world, in all its turning and becoming, its seasons and cycles, its constant reaching from what things are toward what they are capable of being. The world leans, in the deepest sense, in that direction, drawn not by force, but by the nature of things that are incomplete toward the one thing in the whole of existence that is complete. The lamp burns low, the argument rests, the outermost sphere turns in its patient arc across the dark, and will continue to turn through the long hours of the night, drawn in its motion toward the still light of what it can never quite reach and cannot stop moving toward, the way a light continues to shine in a room long after the one who lit it has gone still. Aristotle knelt in the garden at the Lyceum one morning and pressed a seed into the soil with one finger. He did not hurry. The earth was cool and slightly damp, and he held his finger there for a moment after the seed had gone in, as though confirming something, before he rose and brushed the earth from his hand and walked on. Those who were nearby remembered this kind of gesture, the philosopher pausing not at the threshold of some grand argument, but at the small and ordinary event of a thing beginning its way into being. What he had pressed into the ground was not a symbol, it was a fact, and facts of this particular kind, small, living, quietly insistent on becoming what they were, had occupied his thinking for longer than almost any other question he had pursued. The question he kept returning to was not abstract in the way a stranger to his work might assume. It was not the question of what a seed is made of, though that interested him. It was not even the question of what force drives it upward through the dark and into light, though that interested him also. The question, as he had come to hold it, was deeper and at the same time more intimate than either of those. It was the question of what it means for anything to be in the process of becoming what it already, in some sense, is. The seed in the ground was not yet an oak, and yet it was not nothing. It was not simply waiting. It held within its small, hard, actual form something that pointed already, with the whole of its nature, toward the shape it had not yet taken. For a long time in the history of philosophy before him, this question had been treated as either a problem to be solved or a paradox to be dissolved. The difficulty was clean enough when stated plainly. If something comes to be, it must come from somewhere, and if it comes from nothing, how does nothing give rise to something? And if it comes from something already existing, then is it really new or merely rearranged? The philosophers who had wrestled with this earliest had sometimes concluded that change is an illusion, that what appears to move and grow and alter is only the surface of a reality that never moves at all. Others had located the ground of change in a primal substance that rearranges itself continuously, water becoming air, air thickening into earth, the whole world a slow transformation of a single underlying stuff. Each of these answers had something in it, none of them fully satisfied. What Aristotle saw, or what he slowly came to see, across years of sustained observation and argument, was that neither of these approaches asked quite the right question. The choice between permanence and flux, between the eternal and the merely changing, had been set up as if these were the only two possibilities. What was missing from both was an account of the kind of being that belongs to something on its way to becoming what it is, the being that belongs to a thing that is already oriented toward an end it has not yet reached. This was not no being. It was a specific, real, and philosophically important kind of being that had not yet been named. He named it dynamis. The word means, at its most direct, capacity or power, but it means more than that. It names the condition of a thing that is not yet fully what it is, but in which the capacity to become that thing is real and present and active, not a mere possibility floating outside the thing like a shadow, but a structural feature of what the thing actually is right now. The seed has dynamis, the living, directed capacity for oakness, folded into its actual form, present in the weight of it in the hand, and the oak standing at the field's edge in the morning light has something else, something Aristotle called energeia, a word that is harder to translate because it does not map cleanly onto any single English word, though actuality comes close, or the being at work of a thing, the condition of being fully engaged in what one is. The distinction between dynamis and energeia, between potentiality and actuality, sounds, when first encountered, like a tidy conceptual division that philosophers might use to organize their thinking without necessarily revealing anything about the world itself. But Aristotle was not primarily a conceptual organizer. He was a naturalist, a man who had spent long years examining living things in careful and patient detail, and the distinction he was drawing was not a tool he had invented for convenience. It was a feature of the world that he had found by looking. Every living thing he had ever examined was both of these at once, actually what it is, and potentially what it has not yet become. The caterpillar is actually a caterpillar, and potentially a winged thing. The infant is actually a body, breathing and feeding and sleeping, and potentially a speaker of language, a reasoner, a person who will one day sit in a garden and press a seed into the earth and pause before the question of what becoming means. Aristotle had come to this way of thinking in part through his long engagement with Plato, and in part through his rejection of what he found insufficient in Plato's account. Plato had seen clearly that the things of this world are impermanent, that they change and decay and fall short of full perfection, and had concluded from this that what is truly real must be elsewhere, in a realm of pure, unchanging forms that exist apart from the material world, of which particular things are only imperfect reflections. A beautiful face is beautiful because it participates, imperfectly, in the form of beauty. An oak tree is an oak because it participates, imperfectly, in the form of oak. The logic was clean and in its way beautiful, and Aristotle had lived with it for 20 years in Plato's school before he found himself unable to sustain it. The difficulty he kept arriving at was this: a separately existing form, hovering in a transcendent realm, apart from the things of this world, cannot do anything to the things of this world. If beauty is not here in this face, but somewhere else entirely, then its being there does nothing to explain why this face is as it is, why the particular curve of it moves those who see it. To say that the oak participates in a form of oak that exists independently of all actual oaks is to double the world without explaining it. The form needs to be in the thing, not behind it. The form of the oak is not an abstract entity elsewhere. It is what the oak actually is, the immanent structure that makes this particular living, growing, root-spreading thing specifically an oak rather than an elm or a stone or a quantity of undifferentiated matter. He would set Plato's scroll aside after passages like this, not with impatience, or not only with impatience, but with the specific philosophical dissatisfaction of someone who finds a beautiful theory pulling away from the ground. The forms were Plato's way of holding on to what is stable in a world that seems to offer nothing stable. Aristotle understood the desire. He shared it in his own way. What he could not accept was the distance the solution required, the evacuation of intelligible structure from the actual, living, changing world, and its relocation to a realm that could not, by its own account, make contact with anything here. His answer was not to abandon the search for form and structure, but to find it where it actually lives. It lives in the thing. The form of the oak is the oak as fully what it is, the pattern of growth, the structure of leaf and root and bark, the way the whole organism organizes itself toward light and water, the shape that matter takes when oakness is working in it. This form is not external. It is not imposed. It is not a copy of something existing elsewhere. It is what the oak is from inside its own being, the intelligible structure that makes it this and not something else, that orients all its activities toward the completion that oakness, as a natural kind, tends toward. And this is where the concept he called entelecheia comes in, and where his thinking reaches perhaps its deepest and most characteristic note. Entelecheia. The word is built from three Greek roots, the preposition meaning in, the noun meaning end or purpose, and the verb meaning to have. A thing has entelecheia when it has its end within itself, when its purpose is not assigned to it from outside by a craftsman or a law or a divine decree, but is the very form of what it is, the principle by which it develops and sustains and completes itself. An oak does not have oakness as a goal. It is trying to reach in the way that a person might try to reach a city marked on a map. An oak has oakness as its own nature, the internal principle of its self-organization, the form that is already present in the acorn, and that the whole long process of growth is the continuous enactment of. This is, when held still in the mind for a moment, a genuinely unusual way of thinking about what natural things are. The modern instinct is to look at a living thing and ask what forces are acting on it, what pushes it, what pulls it, what chemical processes drive it forward. Aristotle looked at living things and saw something different. He saw things that are not primarily pushed or pulled, but that move in a sense from within, not because there is some ghost in the machine directing the process, but because the form of the thing, its entelecheia, is itself a principle of motion, a real structural feature of the organism that orients it toward its own completion. The acorn does not become an oak because external conditions force it into that shape. It becomes an oak because becoming an oak is what it is, because the form of the oak is already present in the acorn as the organizing principle of everything it does. He had thought about this in relation to the soul, too, and had arrived at a view that departed from nearly everything his predecessors had assumed. The soul, psyche, had been treated by most earlier thinkers as a separate substance somehow resident in the body, a spiritual entity that enters the body at birth and departs it at death, more or less intact, to go somewhere else. Plato had held a version of this, the soul as an immortal thing temporarily housed in perishable matter, its true home elsewhere. Aristotle's account was entirely different, and its difference is connected directly to the way he understood form and matter, potentiality and actuality. The soul, for Aristotle, is the form of a natural body that potentially has life, not a thing inside the body, not a resident in a house. The form of the body, the organizing principle, the entelechia, the structure by which the living body is a living body rather than merely an assemblage of matter arranged in roughly human shape. A hand, separated from the body, is not a hand, he said, except in name. It has the same material. It no longer has the form, the function, the living orientation toward activity that made it a hand. The soul is to the body what the form is to the matter, not a separate addition, but the very principle by which the matter is what it is. And a living body is therefore not a compound of two separate things, awkwardly joined, but a continuous event of form, actualizing itself in matter, matter shaped and organized and kept in its living condition by the form that is its soul. The living human body is not the body plus the soul. The living human body is the soul body together, understood as a single event of actualization, matter continuously achieving the form that makes it alive. There is something in this view that can be felt if attention is turned toward it gently, rather than merely understood as a philosophical position. The breath moving steadily in and out is not a sign of life. It is life, form doing what form does in living matter, the body achieving itself moment by moment in the quiet of the night. Whatever is asleep and breathing in the dark is not a soul inside a body. It is a body that is, right now, a living soul. Form and matter, so thoroughly interpenetrated that to pull them apart, even in thought, is to begin to lose what is actually there. There is a particular quality of attention that this way of thinking asks for. It is not the attention that looks through things to something behind them. It is the attention that looks at things, that stays with them, that allows them to be fully what they are, without reaching past them for a more perfect version elsewhere. Aristotle had this quality of attention in a degree that was unusual even among philosophers. He could look at a squid and find it philosophically serious. He could watch an embryo develop and take what he saw as a question that demanded the same careful, patient thinking as any question about the nature of justice or the structure of the cosmos. The world as it is, looked at closely and honestly, was for him the beginning and the middle, and in a certain sense the end of philosophy, not a stepping stone towards something purer, but the thing itself, worthy of the longest and most careful attention the mind could bring to it. And yet the question of existence, the question he had pressed into the ground along with the seed, was not exhausted by this attention. Even granting all of it, the four causes operating together, the distinction between form and matter, the concept of entelechia, the soul as the form of the living body, something remained that could not be fully answered by pointing to the structure of things. The question was not only how things develop and what form they are, instances of. The question was also why there is anything to develop at all, why there is a world in which form can find matter to inhabit, and things can begin the long process of becoming what they are. Aristotle had given the most careful, patient, structurally complete answer to this question that had yet been offered. He had also, in giving it, made visible with unusual clarity the place where the answer stops and something else begins. The causal chain he had traced runs deep. But the depth of the chain does not eliminate the question of the chain itself. Why is there a chain? Why is there potentiality seeking actuality? Why does form find matter to inhabit? These are not questions Aristotle's framework answers. They are questions it poses more clearly than any framework before it had posed them. This is not a failure. It is, in its own way, the most honest thing a philosophical system can do. Not pretend to have answered everything, but trace the question with sufficient care that what remains unanswered becomes visible in its exact form. Aristotle left his successors not with a closed system, but with a set of genuinely open questions, precisely located, passed forward into the long conversation that would continue without him. That conversation moved in directions he could not have anticipated. In the 13th century, a Dominican friar named Thomas Aquinas sat in his study in Paris and read Aristotle's account of form and matter, potentiality and actuality, and found in it the architectural bones of a way of thinking he wanted to bring into contact with the theological tradition he had inherited. What Aristotle had called the unmoved mover, the ground of all causal activity, pure actuality, without any admixture of potentiality, Aquinas read carefully and then extended. Not the unmoved mover as the final term of a logical argument, he thought, but something more, the source not only of motion, but of existence itself. The reason not merely that things move, but that there is anything to move. The pure subsisting existence from which all particular existences receive their being. This went beyond what Aristotle's text supported, and Aquinas knew it. He was not simply borrowing a philosophical argument, he was entering a conversation and changing it, carrying Aristotle's framework into a different set of questions, redirecting it toward concerns that were not Aristotle's own. The conversation moved further still. More than 6 centuries after Aquinas, in 1927, a German philosopher named Martin Heidegger sat at his writing desk with a window open to the Black Forest and set down a question that had been growing in his thinking for years. The question of being, he wrote, the question of what it means for anything to exist at all, had been asked by Western philosophy since its beginning and had been obscured by that same philosophy almost as soon as it was asked. The obscuring happened in a particular way, by treating being as if it were the highest and most general entity, rather than the ground of all entities. The question had been folded back into the very inquiry it was supposed to underlie. Instead of asking what it means to be, philosophy had asked what beings are made of, what structures they instantiate, what causes them to move and change and develop. Even Aristotle, who had come closer to the genuine depth of the question than any philosopher before him, had, in Heidegger's view, turned away from it at the critical moment, toward the analysis of beings rather than the question of being as such. Heidegger's reading of Aristotle was contested, as such readings always are, and philosophers have argued since about how fair it was. What is less contested is the quality of attention Heidegger was asking for, a kind of thinking that does not pass through the things of the world on its way somewhere else, that does not treat the question of existence as a problem to be organized and solved by the right conceptual apparatus, but that remains open to being as something that cannot be captured by any framework, however careful, however patient, however deeply built. The question for Heidegger was not a question that more thinking alone could answer. It was a question that required a different relationship to questioning itself, a willingness to sit with the open difficulty rather than moving immediately toward resolution. Whether or not one follows Heidegger in this, The challenge he issued has a quality that is recognizable to anyone who has spent time with the question as Aristotle first posed it. There is something about the fact of existence, the sheer, plain, astonishing fact that anything is here rather than not, that thinking approaches but does not quite close. The argument can be followed carefully, the framework can be built patiently, the causes can be traced, the forms identified, the enteletia of each living thing recognized in its particular unfolding. And at the end of all of it, the question remains, not smaller for having been examined, but more clearly shaped, standing in its own exact form against the openness it was asked into. This is not a frustrating result. Aristotle himself did not seem to find it frustrating. He found it, more than anything, generative, the source of the kind of inquiry that does not burn itself out, because its object is not something that can be finally consumed and set aside. The question keeps its life because it is the question of life itself, of the strange and ordinary and everywhere present fact that things are here, that they develop and breathe and grow, that a seed pressed into cool earth in the morning begins, in the dark and in the patience of days, to become what it already, in its small actual form, has always been oriented toward. A flame burning in a lamp in a quiet room does not pause between one moment and the next. Its burning is continuous, uninterrupted, the form of the flame identical with the activity of the flame, not a thing that happens to be burning, but burning itself, form and activity so thoroughly one that to separate them even in thought is to lose the phenomenon. This is what Aristotle meant by a thing that has its end within itself. The flame does not burn in order to achieve something separate from its burning. The burning is what it is. The end is not beyond the activity, but present in every moment of it, the form sustaining itself through the continuous enactment of what it is. Everything alive shares something of this quality. The breathing body in the dark is not moving toward life. It is life, the form continuously achieving itself in the matter that carries it, the soul and body, not two things but one event, unwitnessed except by the night itself and by whatever quiet attention remains open to it. The questions that have traveled through this night, the question of what anything is, the question of how anything changes while remaining what it is, the question of what it would mean to explain fully why something exists rather than not. These questions do not require answers to do what they do. They do not need to be solved to be useful or beautiful or restful in the specific way that genuinely open philosophical questions can be restful when they have been held long enough. The urgency that attaches to them at first, when they arrive with the force of something unresolved, tends to loosen as the inquiry deepens. What takes its place is not complacency or indifference, but something closer to what the long tradition of philosophical contemplation has often described as the natural destination of sustained thinking, not the tension of a problem unsolved, but the openness of a question that has been fully inhabited, lived with rather than fought. Aristotle spent his whole working life in this kind of inhabiting. The questions he asked were not questions he expected to finish answering in a single work or a single decade.